The stars above Earth looked the same as they always had. Quiet, still, full of nothing but light and cold and distance. No one on the ground thought anything strange was coming. The night was just a night. People were sleeping, working, arguing, laughing. Somewhere in a city, a child was pointing at the sky and asking her father what was out there. He told her nothing, just stars. He was wrong. High above the planet, slipping out of the dark between worlds, came the ships. There were 30 of them. Long and gray and built like knives, they moved in tight formation, lights off, silent as thought. They belonged to the Vel'Karath Dominion, an empire that had swallowed 40 star systems in 300 years and never once lost a single ground campaign. The commander of the fleet was Admiral Sorveth. He stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the blue planet turning slowly below him. He had done this before. Different planets, different skies, different species looking up with fear in their eyes. It was always the same in the end. They always gave up. They always had to. Sorveth read the report on his screen again. Sol 3. 1 moon. Oxygen, nitrogen atmosphere. Dominant species. Bipedal, soft-bodied. No natural armor. No venom. No claws worth mentioning. Average lifespan surprisingly long for a Deathworld species, but nothing remarkable. Technology level rated at early interstellar development. Military capability rated as primitive but organized. There was a small note at the bottom of the report. It said the planet had been classified as a Class 4 Deathworld due to extreme weather patterns, high microbial activity, heavy gravity, and an unusually violent evolutionary history. The note recommended caution during ground operations. Sorveth dismissed it. Every conquered world had some kind of warning at the bottom of the report. It was just paperwork. He gave the order to broadcast the surrender message. It went out in 40 languages, translated by the Dominion's best communication systems. The message was clear and polite, as it always was. It told the people of Earth that their world was now claimed by the Vel'Karath Dominion. It told them that resistance would cost lives. It told them that cooperation would be rewarded with a place in the Empire. Modest, but stable. Sorveth waited for the reply. He expected fear, maybe anger, maybe silence, which usually meant they were already preparing to bow their heads. What he got was different. The humans replied in one of their own languages first, then repeated it in rough but functional Vel'Karath standard. The message was short. It said that Earth did not accept the terms. It said that any ship that moved closer to the planet would be fired upon. It said this without shaking. Without any of the usual panic that came from a species facing 30 warships for the first time. Sorveth almost smiled. He had heard brave words before. They never lasted long. He ordered 2 ships forward to begin the orbital pressure campaign. The idea was simple. Show them the firepower. Make the ground shake a little. Let them understand what they were facing. It worked on everyone. The humans fired first. The weapons that came up from the surface were not elegant. They were not the clean energy lances of Vel'Karath design, or the precision plasma systems used by the more advanced species the Dominion had faced. They were physical. Chunks of metal moving at speeds that should not have been possible for a species that had only just reached space. The first salvo missed, the second did not. One of Sorveth's ships took 3 impacts in the engine section, and had to pull back immediately. The bridge went quiet. Sorveth stared at the data. He told himself it was a lucky shot. He ordered the orbital bombardment to begin in earnest. The ships moved into position and hit 3 military sites on the surface with focused beam weapons. It was precise, controlled, meant to demonstrate power without destroying too much. The Empire preferred to conquer intact planets when possible. Ruins were bad for productivity. Then he sent down the ground teams. He sent 3,000 soldiers to the surface in dropships. They were veteran troops, experienced in ground operations across a dozen worlds. Their armor was rated for most atmospheric conditions. Their weapons were reliable. Their training was the best in the Dominion. They landed in a flat region near one of the large human cities. The reports started coming in almost immediately, and none of them made sense. The first thing the soldiers noticed was the gravity. Vel'Karath had evolved on a world with roughly 70% of Earth's gravity. Moving in full combat gear on Earth felt like walking with another soldier strapped to their back. Their legs burned. Their lungs worked harder than normal. Their reaction times dropped. The second thing they noticed was the air. It did not kill them. Their filters handled that. But the filters were working constantly, catching particles and microorganisms that should not have been anywhere near a battlefield. Tiny things, living things. Some of them got through. 3 soldiers reported suit contamination within the first hour. Their skin reacted badly. The third thing they noticed was the humans. They came out of the ground, out of buildings, out of tunnels, out of places the Vel'Karath soldiers had not even identified as potential cover. They came in small groups, and they moved fast. They moved faster than the Vel'Karath, even in the heavy gravity. They seemed completely comfortable in conditions that were already wearing down the invasion force. They breathed the air without filters. They moved through mud and rain and broken terrain without slowing down. The fighting was nothing like the simulations. Vel'Karath military doctrine was built on distance and control. Keep the enemy at range. Use superior firepower. Advance only when the path is clear. It was clean. It was logical. It worked. The humans did not fight that way. They got close. Dangerously, deliberately close. They used the terrain, the weather, the dark, the noise. One unit was reported fighting with handheld tools when their primary weapons failed, and they did not stop. They kept going. They kept pushing forward. A unit that had taken 40% casualties would have triggered an automatic Vel'Karath retreat protocol. These humans had taken more than that, and were still moving. By the end of the first day, 2 of the 3 Vel'Karath ground teams had been forced back to their landing zones. The third was completely cut off. Sorveth sat on his bridge and read the reports one by one. His hands were still. His expression gave nothing away. But somewhere behind his eyes, something old and certain was beginning to crack. He had read the file. He knew this was a Deathworld. He had dismissed it. He was starting to understand what that word actually meant. He called the ground teams back to orbit. He told his officers it was a tactical repositioning. The officers nodded. Nobody believed him. Nobody said so. Down on the surface, in the broken and burning places where the fighting had been, human soldiers were digging in. They were tired. Some of them were hurt. But they were not afraid. They had grown up on a world that had spent 1 billion years trying to kill their ancestors. They had learned something from that, deep in their bones, deep in the place where fear lives. They had learned that surviving the impossible was not a miracle. It was just Tuesday. Admiral Sorveth had not slept since the ground teams came back. He sat in his command chair and stared at the reports and read the same lines over and over, as if they might change meaning if he looked at them long enough. They did not change. The numbers stayed the same. The losses stayed the same. The image of his best ground units retreating through mud and rain from creatures that had no business being that hard to kill stayed the same. He told himself it was a temporary problem, a tactical adjustment. He had simply underestimated the terrain. It happened. The solution was simple. Stop sending soldiers to the surface. Use the ships instead. The Vel'Karath fleet was still 30 strong. Earth had no real space force worth the name. He would break their orbital defenses, darken their cities from above, and make the ground option unnecessary. They would surrender when they understood that the sky itself was against them. He gave the order to begin full orbital bombardment. What happened next was something that would be discussed in Vel'Karath military academies for generations, although not in the way Sorveth would have preferred. The humans fired back. Not from the ground this time, from orbit. They had ships, not many, not large. They were rough-looking vessels, heavy and inelegant, clearly built fast, and with more attention to function than to form. But they came out from behind the moon, and from the dark side of the planet, and from positions that Sorveth's sensors had somehow not flagged as threats, and they came in hard, and they did not slow down. His tactical system identified their weapons as primitive chemical propellant launchers and electromagnetic mass drivers. The system rated them as low-level threats. The system was wrong. The humans had built their weapons the way they built everything, with extra, with more than was needed, with the deep and ancient understanding that on a world that was always trying to kill you, anything less than too much was probably not enough. Their mass drivers fired tungsten slugs at velocities that punched straight through 2 layers of Vel'Karath shielding before the shield emitters even registered the impact. Their missiles did not just follow heat. They anticipated movement. They went where the ship was going to be, not where it was. Sorveth lost a second vessel in the first 4 minutes and had to pull 3 more back for emergency repairs. He stared at his screen and said nothing for a long time. Then, the humans did something that no conquered species, no desperate colony, no cornered and outgunned fleet in the entire history of the Vel'Karath Dominion had ever done before. They boarded his flagship. It started with a small vessel. A single human ship, not much bigger than a heavy transport, broke away from the main group and came at the flagship at full speed on a direct collision course. Every weapon on the flagship opened up on it. It took hits, bad hits. Parts of its hull peeled away in the fire. It kept coming. Sorveth had already opened his mouth to give the order to abandon the section when the small ship did not crash into the flagship. It connected to it. It hit the hull at an angle and locked on with physical clamps, and then something extraordinary happened. The humans welded their own ship directly to his. Not with any sophisticated docking technology, with actual welding equipment, the kind used in shipyards and repair bays and construction sites, operated by soldiers in patched and mismatched suits who were doing it in open vacuum while his hull defense systems were still firing at them. Several of them were hit. They did not stop. The ones who went down were replaced by others who stepped over them without hesitating and kept working. By the time the breach was cut through the flagship's hull, it was already too late to stop it. They came through in a group, maybe 20 of them, moving fast and low through corridors that were not designed for close-quarter fighting, because nothing in Vel'Karath military doctrine had ever seriously imagined needing to fight inside a flagship in orbit. They were wearing gear that looked like it had been repaired multiple times in multiple places by people who were very good at making things work without having all the right parts. Some of them carried weapons that the flagship's internal scanners couldn't even properly categorize. All of them were moving toward the bridge. They were singing or chanting, something rhythmic and low that came through the corridor walls, and the translation system refused to process it as language, kept returning it as noise, but it was clearly deliberate. It was clearly something they were doing together. The sound of it was deeply strange in the clean metal corridors of the flagship, and Sorveth's crew reacted to it in a way they could not fully explain afterward. Something about it was wrong, in a way that went past tactics and into something older. Sorveth's security teams met them twice before they reached the bridge section. Both times, the humans pushed through. They took losses. They kept coming. One of his officers told him the humans had taken enough casualties to trigger a full combat withdrawal by any normal military standard. Sorveth looked at the corridor feeds. They were not withdrawing. He made the decision that cost him more than anything else in his career. He gave the order to abandon the flagship. The escape pods launched in a sequence, and Sorveth was in the last one. He watched through the small viewport as the flagship fell away beneath him. He watched a human soldier appear in the corridor he had just left, moving fast, then stop and look around and realize the bridge was empty. The human stood there for a moment, then turned and went back the way he had come. Sorveth reached a secondary vessel and was pulled aboard. He sat in a chair and did not speak for a long time. They understood, in the way that soldiers always understood things that could not be spoken yet, that their commander was not in shock. He was recalculating, rebuilding, taking everything he thought he knew about war and this species and what was possible, and starting over from the beginning with new information. The flagship was recovered 2 days later, after the human boarding party left. It was intact. The bridge systems were undamaged. The humans had not destroyed anything they did not need to destroy. They had taken data files, communications records, technical manuals. They had left everything else. That bothered Sorveth more than the boarding itself. A species that boarded a flagship through welded holes in vacuum while being shot at, took what it needed, and left everything else intact, was not acting out of desperation. It knew exactly what it was doing, and exactly what it wanted, and had the discipline to stop when it had what it came for. That was not a primitive species. That was not a lucky enemy. That was something the Dominion had never written a file for, because it had never needed to. He sent his full report to High Command. He wrote it in plain language, with no softening and no careful framing. He wrote what he had seen and what he believed it meant. High Command read the report and went very quiet. Somewhere on the blue planet below, humans were already planning what came next. They had been at war with something trying to kill them since before history. A Vel'Karath fleet in orbit was just the latest thing. They were not afraid. They were not finished. 6 months passed after the Vel'Karath fleet ran from Earth's orbit. The stars were quiet again. But quiet did not mean safe. Quiet never meant safe. Not for a species that had grown up on a world where the silence before a storm was the most dangerous silence of all. On Earth, nobody relaxed. The governments that had spent decades arguing over borders and money and old grudges sat down together in the same rooms and talked. Not about the past, about what was coming, because everyone knew, with the kind of knowing that sits in the stomach and does not leave, that the Vel'Karath would be back. They had lost. They had been embarrassed in front of the entire galaxy. Empires did not walk away from that. Empires came back harder. So humanity got to work. The orbital shipyards ran without stopping. 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Workers who had spent their careers building satellites and cargo vessels were now learning how to weld armor plating onto warship hulls. Engineers who argued about bridge designs were now calculating firing angles for railgun arrays. Factories that made farming equipment were retooled inside of 2 months to produce ammunition. The change was not graceful. It was not organized the way a military planner would have liked. It was loud and messy and full of arguments and mistakes. But it moved fast. Humans always moved fast when they were scared and angry at the same time. A retired general named Harlow submitted a document to the Unified Earth Command. It was 900 pages long. He called it Fighting in Their House. It was a complete manual for how to fight an enemy that had superior ships, superior energy weapons, and no experience fighting in close quarters against opponents who were comfortable in hard conditions. It talked about gravity, about atmosphere, about microbe exposure, about using the environment as a weapon. It talked about human pain tolerance and endurance, and the psychological effect of an enemy that simply did not stop moving toward you no matter what you did to them. Every branch of every military on Earth received a copy. It became required reading within a week. Scientists who had never thought about war in their lives were now in rooms with soldiers, talking about how to make suits that breathed in ways that would contaminate enemy armor. Doctors were writing field guides for treating wounds in zero gravity. Teenagers who were brilliant with computers were being recruited to design targeting systems. A woman in a small city in Eastern Europe who had spent 20 years studying fungal biology submitted a proposal for a biological deterrent system that made 3 generals go pale when they read it. They approved it immediately. Earth was not the same planet it had been 6 months ago. It looked the same from orbit. The oceans were blue, the clouds moved in slow white spirals, the lights of cities glittered at night. But underneath all of that, the planet was changing, hardening, like something old waking up and remembering what it was built for. Then the strange ship appeared. It dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the moon, tumbling slightly, one engine dark, the hull scorched and cracked in several places. The automated defense systems locked onto it immediately. 3 human warships moved to intercept within minutes. They held their fire only because the ship was broadcasting on a civilian emergency frequency, which was unusual for a warship, and because it was clearly not capable of threatening anything in its current condition. When the human ships got close enough to scan it, the results came back and every officer on every bridge went very still. It was Vel'Karath. For a moment, nobody moved. The Vel'Karath had come back, but not the way anyone had expected. Not with 300 warships and fire from orbit. One broken ship, broadcasting for help on a frequency meant for lost cargo vessels and distress calls from miners. The order came down from Unified Command to board it carefully. A team went across in full gear, weapons ready, expecting a trap. What they found instead were 47 Vel'Karath soldiers crammed into the undamaged sections of the ship. Some were wounded. All of them were clearly terrified, and not of the humans standing in front of them with guns. They were terrified of something else. The translation software was not perfect. The message came through broken and patchy. But 3 words were clear enough that there was no mistaking them. We need help. It took time to understand the full story. It came out in pieces, through translators working with imperfect software, through gestures and data files pulled from the damaged ship's computer. But the shape of it became clear soon enough. While the Vel'Karath Dominion had been focused on Earth, something else had been moving. An empire called the Greth Collective had been quietly swallowing Vel'Karath frontier systems, one by one. Not with big dramatic battles, with slow, careful, patient advance. The Greth were ancient. They had been expanding for centuries. They moved like deep water, steady and cold, and always forward. The Vel'Karath had not noticed how close the Greth had gotten, because all of their attention had been pointing the other direction. These 47 soldiers were the survivors of a border garrison that the Greth had overrun in less than a day. Their commander was dead, their base was gone, they had no orders and nowhere to go, and somehow, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps because the humans were the only ones who had shown the Vel'Karath Dominion was not unbeatable, they had come here, to the Deathworld, to ask for help. Unified Earth Command received the full report and called an emergency session. The room was full of generals and politicians and scientists and people who disagreed with each other about almost everything. They listened to the report. They looked at the data. They looked at each other. Then they voted. The debate lasted 11 minutes. That was all. 11 minutes to decide whether to help the species that had come to their world 6 months ago with 30 warships and a surrender demand. Some people argued against it. Their arguments were not wrong. The Vel'Karath had come to conquer Earth. Helping them now carried risks. The Greth were unknown. The situation beyond Earth's system was not fully understood. But the vote was not close, because humans had not survived 1 billion years on the hardest world in the known galaxy by being the kind of species that ignored a distress call. That was not something they were capable of. It was not cruelty that drove them onto dangerous ground. It was not stupidity. It was something older and deeper than either of those things. It was the same thing that made a person run into a burning building for a stranger. The same thing that made a soldier go back into fire for a wounded enemy. It did not need to. It was just who they were. Orders went out before the session was even formally closed. Ships were being loaded. Soldiers were being briefed. General Yara Okonkwo, who had lost her left arm in the initial Velkarath invasion and replaced it with a prosthetic she had designed herself on a field table, was given command of the Joint Task Force. She accepted without hesitation. Outside the window of the command center, the moon hung pale and steady in the dark sky. Somewhere beyond it, in the cold and the silence between stars, something was moving toward a fight it did not yet know was waiting for it. The humans were coming, and they were bringing the people who had tried to conquer them. Because on Earth, that was simply what you did. The task force left Earth's orbit on a cold morning. 18 human warships, 4 Velkarath vessels that were still functional, and 1 battered rescue ship carrying 47 soldiers who still could not fully believe what was happening to them. They moved together in a loose formation, pointed at the far edge of Velkarath frontier space, where the Greth Collective was waiting, without knowing it was waiting. Admiral Sorveth stood in the observation bay of the lead Velkarath ship and watched the human vessels through the viewport. They were not beautiful ships. They were heavy and angular, and covered in weapons that looked like they had been added on quickly, because they probably had been. But they moved with confidence, clean and direct, no hesitation in their trajectory, like they had somewhere important to be and fully intended to get there. He had surrendered his flagship to escape an invasion he had started. Now he was taking orders from a human general. He thought about that for a long time, and could not find the words in any language he knew to explain how strange it felt. General Yara Okonkwo ran her briefings the way she ran everything. Directly. She did not waste words. She stood in front of her officers and the Velkarath commanders, and she spoke clearly, and when she was done, she asked if anyone had questions. And when someone asked something she already knew, she answered it anyway, without making them feel small for asking. Sorveth watched her work, and began to understand something he had not understood before about why the humans had fought the way they did. It came from the top. It ran all the way down. The journey took 11 days. In that time, the human soldiers and the Velkarath soldiers began slowly and awkwardly to share the same spaces. It was not comfortable. There was a great deal of silence and careful distance in the beginning. But 11 days is a long time when you are stuck on ships together, and humans had an instinct for filling silence with noise. They played games, and then showed the games to the Velkarath. They cooked food that smelled extremely strong, and offered it around, and seemed genuinely pleased when a Velkarath soldier tried some and did not immediately die. They told jokes that did not translate well, but laughed anyway. By the end of the journey, the silence had changed. It was still there, but it was a different kind. Not the silence of strangers. The silence of people who had not yet found the right words, but were working on it. Then they arrived at the frontier. The first Greth patrol found them on the second day, inside Velkarath space. It was a scouting force, small, 3 ships moving in the tight geometric formation that Greth commanders preferred. They moved with precision, every angle calculated, every approach covered. They were masters of ambush and encirclement. They had been fighting wars for longer than humans had been building cities. They had never seen anything like what happened next. Okonkwo did not wait for them to complete their formation. She hit them before the pattern was set. 2 human ships went straight at the center of the formation, at full speed, while the others came in from angles the Greth had not calculated, because no military doctrine they knew suggested those angles were useful. The Greth formation broke apart trying to respond. It was over in 9 minutes, 2 Greth ships disabled, 1 retreating. Sorveth reviewed the battle data afterward and ran it through his tactical system 3 times. The system kept flagging the human approach vectors as statistically inadvisable. Okonkwo had looked at that same data and done the opposite of what the system recommended. He pulled up her approach again and looked at it from a different angle, and slowly began to see what she had seen. She was not ignoring logic. She was using a different logic, one built on instinct and risk, and the deep understanding that an enemy who had never been surprised before was more vulnerable to surprise than almost anything else. He stopped arguing with her tactical calls after that. The Greth Collective responded to the patrol loss by sending a larger force. 40 ships arrived at the frontier in a wide sweep, moving in multiple overlapping formations, covering every obvious approach. It was a masterpiece of patient military geometry. Slow, certain, unstoppable. Okonkwo looked at it and said it reminded her of a net. Then she said the best thing to do with a net was find where it was thinnest and push everything through one hole at once. Her officers looked at the map. They found the spot. It was not a safe move. It put the entire task force through one narrow gap with Greth ships on 3 sides. Every calculation said the losses would be severe. Okonkwo gave the order anyway. They went through the gap at full speed with every weapon firing, human and Velkarath ships together, pushing so hard and so fast that the Greth formations on either side could not rotate quickly enough to respond. Before the task force was already through and turning. The humans were loud during the fight. They talked on open comms, calling positions, calling warnings, calling each other by name. The Velkarath had never fought that way. They had protocols and call signs and formal structures. The human way felt chaotic. Somehow it was not. The Greth lost 11 ships in 40 minutes. The task force lost 2, both human. Sorveth watched the human crews deal with the losses afterward, and it was one of the hardest things he had ever watched. They grieved fast, and then went back to work. Not because they did not care, because they cared too much to stop. There was a cost to it. He could see it in their faces. They paid it anyway. The push to the Greth command installation took 4 more days, 2 more battles, each one the same pattern. The Greth set a perfect trap, and the humans broke it by doing something the trap had not been designed to stop, because no sane military would have tried it. At the installation itself, Okonkwo did something no one expected. She broadcast a message to the Greth forces inside, not a demand for surrender, not a threat. She told them that the Velkarath frontier worlds they had taken were going to be returned. She told them that the Greth military command had started a war of conquest, and that the people of the Greth worlds were not the same as the people who had given those orders. She said the task force was not there to destroy the Greth. It was there to stop the ones who were giving the orders. Sorveth heard that message and sat very quietly for a long time. It took 2 more hours of fighting to reach the command center. When it was over, the Greth military command was in custody and the installation was secured. No civilian sites had been touched. Okonkwo had been very specific about that. She had said it more than once and in more than one language, so there was no way to misunderstand. She walked through the secured installation in her uniform, the prosthetic arm moving the same as the real one, the scorch mark on her left shoulder that she had refused to have cleaned still clearly visible. A Greth officer was brought to her, the most senior surviving commander. He looked at her for a long time. He had fought humans for the first time 3 weeks ago, and he was still trying to understand what he had encountered. He asked her, through a translator, why she had bothered making the distinction between his military and his people, why it mattered to her. She looked at him steadily, and said that where she came from, it had always mattered. He did not have an answer for that. Neither did Sorveth, standing in the doorway, listening. But he thought about it for a very long time. The neutral station floated at the edge of 3 territorial boundaries, which was the only reason everyone agreed to meet there. It was old. The metal of its outer hull had been patched so many times, in so many different materials, that it looked like a quilt sewn by someone who kept running out of thread. But it was neutral, and it was stable, and in a galaxy that was currently short on both of those things, that counted for a great deal. 17 species sent representatives. Some came in large ships, with full delegations and ceremonial guard units. Some came alone in small vessels, with a single aide and a translation device. The Velkarath came with 3 ships, and a silence around them that was new. The Greth sent 2 representatives, which surprised everyone, including the Greth. The humans came in 4 warships and a transport vessel, and their delegation walked onto the station in clean uniforms that had clearly been pressed for the occasion, although at least one of the officers was still wearing boots that had dried mud on the soles. Nobody said anything about the boots. The summit opened formally, and then immediately became informal, because several delegations had things they needed to say before the official agenda could begin. A species called the Terath, small and cautious and very old, spoke first. They said they had been watching everything: the initial Velkarath assault on Earth, the failed ground campaign, the boarding of the flagship, the joint operation against the Greth Collective. They had watched all of it from a distance, the way the Terath had always watched things, carefully and quietly and without getting involved. They said they were reconsidering that policy. The Mref, who had 3 star systems in a region the Greth Collective had been eyeing for decades, said they had been afraid to speak before. They were less afraid now. A species that communicated through color patterns in their skin shifted through a long sequence that the translators described as something between gratitude and cautious hope. An ancient trading confederation that had not sent a representative to any summit in 40 years sent one now. She was very old, and she sat very still, and she listened to everything before she said a single word. In the middle of all of this, Admiral Sorveth stood up. He had asked to address the Velkarath Dominion High Command directly. His request had been granted, which in itself was unusual. High Command did not normally take addresses from fleet admirals at neutral summits. They gave orders. The fact that they listened to him now said something about how much had changed in 6 months. He spoke for a long time. He did not use formal language. He used plain words, the kind that could not be misunderstood, because he needed what he said to land clearly and stay there. He told them that he had read the file on Earth before the invasion. He told them he had seen the Class 4 Deathworld classification and dismissed it as routine. He told them that was the first mistake. Then he listed the others. The assumption that primitive technology meant limited capability. The assumption that a species without empire meant a species without strength. The assumption that beings who were soft-bodied and short-clawed and had no natural armor were therefore weak. He said the humans were not weak. He said they were the product of a world that had been trying to kill their ancestors since before the Velkarath had learned to write. Every reflex, every instinct, every cultural habit, every military tradition, every piece of their medicine, and their engineering, and their music came from that. 1 billion years of a planet that refused to let anything survive easy, had built something that the galaxy had never accounted for, and did not have a category for. He said the second mistake was more serious than the first. He said the second mistake was assuming that because humans were dangerous, they were something to be feared and controlled. He said that watching General Okonkwo operate, watching the task force fight and grieve and push forward and win, had shown him that the danger was not the point. The point was what the danger was attached to. A species that dangerous could have used the Greth campaign to take territory, to build an empire of their own, to make the other species of the galaxy understand exactly what kind of position Earth was now in. They had not done any of that. They had gone out to help. They had fought hard and lost people, and won, and then refused to claim anything for it except the return of the Velkaroth worlds the Greth had taken. Okonkwo had walked into the secured Greth installation and made a distinction between the military command and the civilian population, loudly and clearly, and for the record, when no one was requiring her to, when it would have been easy not to. Sorveth said he did not have a word in his language for what that was. He said he thought it might be the most dangerous thing about them. Not the railguns, not the soldiers who charged into encirclements, not the adaptability, or the endurance, or the willingness to board an enemy flagship with welding equipment. The most dangerous thing about humans was that they meant it. When he sat down, the room was very quiet. Then General Okonkwo walked to the front. She was not a large person. She was medium height, solidly built, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had looked at very hard things and not looked away. The prosthetic arm caught the light of the station as she turned to face the room. The scorch mark on her shoulder was still there. Nobody had asked her to remove it. She would not have done so if they had. She stood in front of 17 species, representing more star systems than she could count. And she spoke simply, the way she always did, in the plain language of someone who had no interest in being misunderstood. She said that Earth had not come to the summit to claim anything. She said they had not helped the Velkaroth because it was strategically smart, although it had turned out to be. They had not gone after the Greth Collective to build influence or reputation, although both of those things had followed. She said the vote in Unified Command had taken 11 minutes, and it had not been close, and the reason it had not been close was simple. They had received a distress call. You answer distress calls. That was it. That was all of it. She said that humanity had not survived on the hardest world in the known galaxy by being the strongest thing on it. There had always been something stronger, something faster, something with better teeth, or more venom, or a thicker hide. What kept humans alive, generation after generation, on a planet that wanted them dead, was not the ability to beat everything. It was the ability to work together, even when working together was hard. To trust each other, even when trust was a risk. To come back for each other, even when coming back was costly. She said she did not know what the galaxy was going to look like in 10 years. She did not know what alliances would form, or what threats would come out of the dark that nobody had mapped yet. But she said Earth's position on all of it was the same as it had always been. You call, we come. She walked back to her seat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the old woman from the Trading Confederation, who had not spoken yet, made a long, slow gesture with both hands, that the translators said was the closest thing her species had to applause. The Turath representative followed. Then the color-patterned species rippled through something bright and fast that the translators gave up trying to interpret and marked simply as strong positive. Even the Greth representatives were still. At the back of the room, Sorveth watched all of it. Earth's flag, a blue dot on a field of black, raised on the neutral station's display wall for the first time, next to the flags of every other species in the room. It was a small flag. The dot in the middle was very small. But it was there. Humanity had not come to the stars to conquer them. They had not built an empire, and they had not demanded tribute, and they had not turned their Deathworld soldiers and their over-engineered weapons into a tool for taking things from people who were weaker. They had just kept doing what they had always done. They had answered the call. And somehow, without planning it, or naming it, or fully understanding what it meant, in the middle of a galaxy full of empires and fear, and cold political calculation. That had turned out to be enough.